Magandang araw po sa bawat isa. Today, I will be presenting my report on organizational influence on educational policymaking, comparing the Philippines and Canada. So the title of my presentation is Organizational Influence on Educational Policymaking, Understanding the Hidden Actors Shaping Our Schools, Comparing the Philippine and Canadian Experiences. Over the next few hours or minutes, so we will explore how different organizations, some are visible and some are hidden, they shape the policies that govern our schools. By comparing the Philippines and Canada, we can see how different historical, constitutional, and political contexts create different patterns of organizational influence while also revealing common challenges that both countries are facing. Let us begin our exploration into understanding who really makes education policy. Here is our roadmap for today's presentation. We will cover 10 main areas. First, we will look at the big picture. Why understanding organizational influence matters in education. Second, I will introduce the key theoretical frameworks that scholars use to understand this phenomenon. Third, we will examine the Philippine context in detail, the key government actors, historical institutional arrangements, recent research findings, current policy debates, and emerging organizational actors. Fourth, we will turn into Canadian context, focusing on two provinces, the Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador. These two provinces show different approaches to a common challenge: what to do about school boards. Fifth, I will discuss the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, and how this international organization influences education policy in both countries. Sixth, we will do a comparative analysis identifying key differences and similarities between the Philippines and Canada. Seven, we will examine the mechanisms of influence, how organizations actually shape policy. 8, we will look at the emerging research on mid-level network, that the concept of strategic pathwork. Then, 9th, we will explore the strategic foresight and the implication for both countries, what trends are emerging, and what questions we need to ask about the future. Finally, we will conclude with the key takeaways and open the floor for discussion. There's a lot to cover, and let's get started. So let us begin with the fundamental question. So who really makes education policy? In the traditional view, the one most people hold is that the policy is made by elected officials, school board, and the government agencies. In the Philippines, that would be the Congress, the Senate, the Department of Education. And in Canada, that would be provincial legislators and ministries of education. However, research showed that this view is incomplete. A more complete picture is that the policy emerges from complex interaction among multiple organizations. These organizations include not just agencies or government agencies, but also research institution, philanthropic foundation, nonprofit organization, advocacy groups, business association, and increasingly international organizations like the OECD. As one scholar notes, education inequalities and student outcomes are distally influenced not just by policy, but also organizations that initiate, implement, and institutionalize them. The key insight here is that understanding organizational influence helps us to see both of the opportunities and constraints in educational change. So when we only look at formal policy documents, we miss the behind-the-scenes work of organizations that shape what policies are considered, how are they designed, and whether they are successfully implemented. Now, why compare Philippines and Canada? For some reasons, there are three ideas. First, both countries face similar challenges of centralization versus decentralization. Both are grappling with questions about how much power should rest at the national or provincial level versus how much should be given to local schools and communities. Second, both can have active non-state actors shaping policy, from business groups to teachers association to international organization. Third, both are wrestling with fundamental questions about democratic governance. How do we ensure that the public has a voice in education policy? And how do we maintain accountability when power is concentrated in distant bureaucracies? So by comparing these two countries, we can learn from each other's experiences and see patterns that might not be visible when studying in just one context. To understand organizational influence, we need a theoretical framework. One of the most influential theories in educational organizational studies is a coupling theory, which originated with Carl Wick in 1976. Coupling theory asks a simple but powerful question: how connected are the different parts of educational system? Now let me explain the two main concepts. First, loose coupling. In a loosely coupled system, there are weak links between policy and practice. Elements of the system can act independently. Communication is indirect. A classic example is teachers adapting curriculum in their own classrooms. The central office may issue a policy, but what actually happens in the classroom can vary widely from teacher to teacher. This gives teachers autonomy and flexibility, but it also means that policy intention may not translate into actual practice. Second, tight coupling. In a tightly coupled system, there are strong connections between elements. Actions are coordinated, communication is direct. A classic example is the standardized testing with strict accountability measures. When test scores are tied to school funding or teacher evaluation, I know you can relate with this, schools have strong incentives, like the PVB, to align their practices with the testing requirements. Why does this matter for our topic? Because the degree of coupling affects how policy actually get implemented. In a loosely coupled system, organizational influence may be more diffuse and harder to trace. In a tightly coupled system, organizational influence may be more direct and visible. Both the Philippines and Canada have elements of both loose and tight coupling, but in different configurations. More recently, scholars have extended coupling theory to look at the relationship between organizations. This is called interorganizational coupling. The key question is, how do organizations working together to influence policy implementation? Researchers have identified three important dimensions of interorganizational coupling. First, dependence. How much do organizations rely on each other for resources, information, or legitimacy? When one organization controls funding that another needs, that creates a relationship of dependence. Second, formal collaboration. These are official partnerships, contracts, and memoranda of agreement. When organizations sign formal agreements, they create structured relationships that shape how they work together. Third, informal ties. These are the personal relationship, information sharing networks, and trust-based connections that exist between individuals in different organizations. Often, these informal ties are more important than formal ones in determining how organizations actually work together. The research finding is that the structure of organizational networks affects three things: the speed of policy implementation, the variation of how policy are implemented across different sites, and the constraints that organizations face in implementing policies. As we examine the Philippines and Canada, we will see example of all three dimensions at work. Before we dive into specific countries, let me introduce the cast of characters, the types of organizations that typically influence education policy. First, the government agencies. These are the official bodies responsible for the implementing and monitoring policy. In the Philippines, that includes DepEd for basic education, CHED for higher education, and TESDA for technical vocational education. In Canada, that includes provincial ministries of education. Second, research organizations and universities. These institutions create knowledge and evaluate programs. They conduct studies that can shape policy debates. In the Philippines, universities like Ateneo and UP and our school, the PSU-OU, do important research. In Canada, universities like the University of Toronto and Memorial University do the same. Third, philanthropic foundation. These organizations provide funding and priorities. The Gates Foundation is a well-known example internationally. But there are also local foundations in both countries that fund education program. Fourth, school support nonprofits. These organizations work directly with schools, providing training, curriculum materials, or other services. In the Philippines, the Philippine Business for Education, or PBED, is a good example. Fifth, advocacy organization. These groups lobby for specific policies. They may push for more funding, curriculum changes, or practical reforms. In Canada, teachers' union and student federations are active advocates. Six, business and industries group. These organizations influence workforce-related education. They want school to produce graduates with skills that employers need. Seventh, international organizations. Groups like OECD, UNESCO, and the World Bank set global agendas and standards. National governments often feel pressure to adopt their recommendations. As we examine the Philippines and Canada, we will see examples of all these types of organizations at work. Let us now turn to the Philippine context, starting with the key government actors. The Philippine education system is primarily managed by three major actors or three major agencies. So first, we have the Department of Education. Second, the Commission on Higher Education. And third, the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, or TESDA. And one of the most important developments in recent Philippine education policy is the EDCOM model. So EDCOM stands for Congressional Commission on Education. EDCOM 2 was a comprehensive study of Philippine education conducted from 2020 to 2023. It brought together legislators, experts, stakeholders to assess the state of education and make recommendations for reform. Now, there is a proposal for EDCOM 3, and I believe it was cancelled, and the EDCOM 2 is being extended. But however, I'm gonna mention this. This EDCOM 3, which could create a new structure where the heads of DepEd, CHED, and TESDA become full commissioners with voting powers. As Senator Alan Peter Cayetano said, this change ensures that the very agencies implementing education policy are directly involved in shaping and monitoring it. This is a significant shift because it formalizes the role of implementing agencies in ongoing policy development and oversight. It is an example of how organizational relationships are being restructured to improve coordination and accountability. One of the most fascinating findings in research on the Philippine education is that multi-sectoral representation in education policy is not new. In fact, it dates back to 1954. The Republic Act number 1124, enacted in 1954, created the Boards of National Education. This was a 15-member with an interesting composition. The board include government officials and Secretary of Education and the Congressional Education Chairs. But it also included 8 representatives from governments from organized sectors like labor, industry, and management, agriculture, the National Catholic Educational Association, what the law called Mohammedan or other cultural minority, referring to Muslim communities, the Philippines Association of Christian Schools, the Philippine Association of Colleges and Universities, and the teaching profession. This is remarkable. In 1954, the Philippines already recognized that education policy should not be made solely by government officials. It should include voices from business, labor, agriculture, religious institution, and minority communities. The key insight here is that the idea of organizational influence on education policy has deep roots in the Philippines. The historical perspective is that it is important for strategic foresight because it reminds us that current arrangements are not inevitable. They are the product of historical decisions and they can be changed. Now let me share some recent findings on the research that shed lights on how education reform actually happens in the Philippines. Dr. Ann Candelaria from Ateneo de Manila University conducted a study examining education reform in the Philippines over 8 decades from 1925 to 2013. Her findings are revealing. She found that many reform attempts were, in her words, sparse and disconnected. Ideas would emerge, gain some attention, and then fade away without being implemented. Take the K-12 reform, which was finally enacted in 2013. Dr. Candelaria found that this was not a new idea. It had been suggested decades earlier. So why did it finally happen in 2013? She finally identified 3 factors that came together to make K-12 happen. First, international commitment. The Philippines was participating in international discussion about education standard and felt pressured to align with global norms. Second, the bureaucratic stability. Unlike previous periods when education leadership changed frequently, there was sufficient stability in bureaucracy to see the reform through. Third, legislative support. Congress was willing to pass the necessary legislation. Dr. Candelaria's conclusion is important for our topic. She argues that education reform should be seen as an institution itself, an independent object that persists within the political landscape. Ito yung tanong ko nung nakaraan ng first term sa financial management. Kasi na-topic po yun. Na, is there any law that would protect the curriculum or the education system from the ever-changing political leaders. Kasi nababago ang curriculum kapag nababago din yung leaders. So reforms have their own trajectories that are shaped by organizational actors but not completely controlled by any single one. So this reminds us that the organizational influence is complex and multifaceted. No single organization controls the process, but many organizations shape it. One of the most significant policy debates in the Philippines today concerns centralization versus decentralization. EDCOM2 research found that despite policy ostensibly aimed at decentralization, DepEd remains heavily centralized. What does this mean in practice? The decision-making is concentrated at the central office in Manila. There is a culture of what researchers call control and over-compliance. Instead of encouraging innovation at the local level, the system incentivizes school to simply follow orders from above. This is a real consequences with a school-based management system, or SBM, which was designed to empower local schools, has become largely a compliance exercise rather than a genuine tool for empowerment. Schools fill out the required forms, but they do not actually have authority to make meaningful decisions. What are the barriers to decentralization? EDCOM2 identified several. First, there's a limited resources at the local level. Many divisions and schools lack for funding to exercise genuine autonomy. Second, capacity constraint. Local officials may not have the training or the experience to take on additional responsibilities. Third, excessive requirements. The central office continues to impose numerous reporting requirements that keep local schools focused on compliance rather than innovation. Fourth, legal limitation on LGUs. The legal framework does not clearly define what authority LGUs have over education. So the challenge, as EDCOM2 frames it, is moving beyond top-down approach to address the diverse needs of learners across the Philippines' more than 7,000 islands. Now let me turn to an emerging organizational actors in Philippine education, the public-private partnerships, or PPPs. Here is the context. The Philippines faces a massive classroom shortage. For over 165,000 classrooms are needed nationwide. The government cannot build them all quickly enough on its own. So the PSIP-3 or third initially approved the construction of 16,000 classrooms in areas with the most severe shortages. This project is expected to create 250,000 jobs and generate an 11.47% economic return. Who are the key players involved? They include the PPP Center of the Philippines, DepEd, and the Department of Finance, and the Philippine Business for Education, or PBED, and various private sectors. As Secretary Sonny Angara stated, PPP is the bridge between urgency and execution. We invite the private sector not as donors, but as co-architects of national development. One interesting detail, PSIP-3 was approved in just 36 days. Compared to over a year for previous phases, this acceleration was due to the PPP code, which standardized and streamlined the approval process. So what does this tell us about organizational influence? So it shows how formal mechanisms, in this case, the PPP legal framework, can create structured relationship between government and private sector's organization. It also shows how organizations like PBED play an intermediary role, bringing together government and business to address common problems. The question for the future is whether PPPs will expand beyond infrastructure into other areas of education, such as curriculum, development, or teaching. So before we turn to Canada, I need to address an important organizational actor, the Organization for Economic Co-Cooperation and Development, or OECD. So the OECD is an international organization based in Paris with 38 members. Canada is a founding member. The Philippines is not a member but participates in many OECD programs and assessments. So una sa PISA, no? And then namumuna pala tayo sa STRI, So later on, I will be mentioning the SDRI. So why does the OECD matter for educational policy? There are several reasons. So why does the OECD matter for education policy? There are several reasons. First, the OECD runs the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA. This is a global test administered every 3 years to 15-year-old students in reading, mathematics, and science. For over 80 countries are now participating, including our country. So PISA has been described as the Olympic of education because of the widespread attention that country our rankings receive. Government pay close attention to PISA and often use them to justify policy changes. Second, the OECD conducts countries' reviews and makes policy recommendation. It publishes regular economic surveys that includes educational policy advice. It also produces thematic reports on topics like adult skills, early childhood education, and vocational training. Third, OECD develops indicators that allow countries to compare their education system. In its annual publication, Education at Glance is widely used by policymakers and researchers. Fourth, the OECD creates networks and forums where policymakers share best practices. For Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, the OECD runs the Southeast Asia Regional Policy Network on Education and Skills, which has been meeting since 2008. The key point is that the OECD is not just a research organization. It actively shapes policy agendas by defining what counts as an education system, by creating comparative data that pressures countries to improve by providing platform for policy diffusion across countries. So let us look specifically at how OECD influences countries. In the Philippines, OECD influence operates primarily through 3 channels. First, and most visibly, through PISA. The Philippines first participated in PISA in 2018. The results were sobering. The Philippines scored among the lowest of all participating countries. In the 2022 PISA, the Philippines posted the second lowest mean score, tied with Uzbekistan, but higher than Albania. Over 75% of 15-year-old Filipino students were below the minimum level of proficiency in math, science, and reading. These results have been significant policy impact. They have been used to justify curriculum reforms, including the Matatag curriculum, which aims to decongest the curriculum and focus on foundational skills. As Congressman Roman Romulo explained, the low rating were the result of congestion in the curriculum. If students cannot master basic functional literacy, they cannot improve higher literacy skills. Second, the OECD makes direct policy recommendation to the Philippine government. Recently, the OECD called on the Philippine government to phase out VAT exemption, including those for private education. This is controversial because it affects private schools and the families that rely on them. The OECD also recommended establishing a tiered social protection system and reforming public administration. This recommendation shows that the OECD influence extends beyond education, narrowly defined to broader fiscal and social policy that affects education. Third, the Philippines participates in OECD networks through the Southeast Asia Regional Policy Network on Education and Skills. The Philippine officials engage with counterparts from other countries and learn about policy innovation elsewhere. But there is also a pushback. Former Secretary Leonor Briones has cautioned against uncritically adopting OECD standards. She reminded policymakers, we have to keep in mind that even as we worry, even as we respect the PISA standards and try to conform to OECD practices and standard, that we have our own development goals as well. We have our constitution, our laws. She also raised questions about whether it makes sense to compare 15-year-olds across countries with very different histories, culture, and challenges. This tension between global standards and local context is an important theme in understanding organizational influence. In Canada, OECD relationship is different because of Canada's constitutional structure. As we will discuss, Canada has no federal Department of Education. Education is a provincial responsibility, so how does a province-based system engage in an international organization? The answer is through the Council of Ministries of Education, Canada or CMEC, which represents all provinces and territories in international forums. Canada has participated in the OECD indicators of education system programs since its inception in 1988. This means that for nearly 40 years, Canadian education officials have been working with OECD frameworks and methodologies. The Pan-Canadian Education Indicators Program, mainly by Statistics Canada and CMIC, aligns many of its indicators with OECD education at glance. This allows for comparison between Canadian provinces and other OECD countries. Canada also participates fully in PISA. The results are watched closely by provincial policies and often featured in media coverage. However, because there is no federal education department, there is no single national response to PISA results. Each province decides how to interpret and respond to the findings. No pressure. The OECD's influence in Canada is perhaps most visible in policy research and advocates. The OECD's reports on adult skills, early childhood education, and higher education are cited by researchers and advocates pushing for policy changes. Canadian universities also offer courses that explicitly reference OECD countries as a comparison group. For example, the University of Alberta offers a course on educational policy and reforms that examines reforms in Canada and other selected OECD countries. That's true. The key point is that OECD influence in Canada is more diffuse than the Philippines, but still significant. It operates through data provision, comparative benchmarking, and the creation of policy discourses that shape how Canadians think about education. Now let us turn to Canada. Starting with its unique constitutional framework, the most important fact about Canadian education is this: there is no national education system and no federal Department of Education. This is the result of the Constitution Act of 1867, which has assigned exclusive legislative authority over education to the provinces. This means Canada has not one education system, but 13 distinct systems, one for each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. Each province has its own education ministry, its own curriculum, its own funding formulas, and its own governance structure. This creates enormous variation across the country. What happens in Ontario schools may be quite different from what happens in British Columbia or Nova Scotia. To coordinate among themselves, the provinces and territories created the Council of Ministries of Education, Canada, or CMEC. CMEC provides a forum for ministers to discuss common concerns, coordinate national activities, and share information. It also represents Canadian education internationally, including the OECD. The implication for our topic is that the organizational influence operates different in each province. There is no single national pattern. National advocacy organizations must engage with 13 different governments. International organizations like OECD must work through CEMIC or CEMIC and provincial ministries. For this presentation, I will focus on 2 provinces, Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador. These 2 provinces show different approaches to a common challenge: what to do about school boards. In Ontario, school boards still exist but are losing power. Several are under provincial supervision. In Newfoundland and Labrador, school boards have been abolished and replaced with a new advisory structure. Let me begin with Ontario, where we see a significant crisis facing elected school boards. School boards are locally elected bodies that govern school districts. They are supposed to provide democratic voice and local accountability. In theory, parents vote for trustees who represent their interest in education decision. However, since the 1990s, the Ontario government has progressively stripped the school boards for their powers. What powers have been lost? School boards can no longer set taxes. They cannot alter curriculum. Their roles have been reduced to what one scholar calls corporate director, while superintendents, appointed officials, run the show. Now, this creates a fundamental contradiction. Trustees are expected to be both grassroots advocates, listening to parents and communities, and balcony view governors, overseeing the system from above. This is a difficult balancing act. The result, according to research, is confusion, frustration, impotence, and irrelevance. One scholar, Paul Bennett, puts it this way: that's democracy, not vacancy. This matters for organizational influence because when democratic bodies lose power, other organizations fill the vacuum. Provincial ministries gain more control. Advocacy groups shifts their attention to provincial officials rather than local trustees. Parents lose a channel for influence. As February 2026, 7 school boards in Ontario are under provincial supervision. Let me list them. Toronto District School Board, Toronto Catholic District School Board, Peel District School Board, Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, Ottawa Carleton District School Board, Tamis Valley District School Board, and Near North District School Board. Together, these boards serve approximately 1/3 of all students in Ontario. This represents a significant portion of the province's students' population whose local school boards are not really in control. Why did this happen? Education Ministry Paul Calandra cites several reasons: trustee infighting, financial mismanagement, legal fees costing taxpayers money, and construction delays that meant students could not start in new buildings. When 1/3 of students have no real local representation, questions arise about who speaks for them and who knows their specific needs. As one parent noted, someone who knows the area, who is from the area, who knows the school, can help solve the problems more quickly and logically. When decisions are made in Toronto, far away from local communities, that local knowledge can be lost. Knowing that Canada has a lot of, especially the Ontario, is the catch basin of all immigrants. So yeah, they are protecting also. They have struggled in maintaining their identity. In November 2025, the Ontario government passed the Bill 33, called Supporting Children and Students Act. This gives the government more power over school boards. First, it allows the government to more easily remove and replace elected trustees. If the minister decides a trustee is not doing their job, they can be removed. Second, it allows the government to take over school boards and temporarily appoint supervisors. This is what happens with the 7 boards mentioned earlier. Ang hirap din pumasok dyan because of some business like that. Third, it mandates police in schools. School resource officer programs become mandatory where they are offered. This is controversial because some communities have concerns about police in schools. Fourth, it gives the minister expanded power to make new regulation. This is a board grant authority. Education Minister Paul Calandra states Bill 33 is all about putting school boards back on track that fall off the rails. However, critics see it differently. The NDP leader, although we don't know them, Marit Stiles, suggested that the government is more interested in politics than solving class size and teacher burnout issues, and the ETFO President David Mastin called it travesty and expressed concern about this concentration of power. Parents have also expressed concerns about loss of transparency, canceled board meetings, and lack of visibility into what is happening. This trend towards centralization in Ontario parallels with the Philippines, of what we see in the Philippines, where DepEd Manila makes most decisions in both places. Local voice gets squeezed out. There is a real debate happening in Ontario about whether this centralization is beneficial or harmful. On one side, there is what scholars call the neoliberal argument for centralization. This argues that centralization is about efficiency, about having consistent education across the province, and about ending dysfunction in school boards cannot manage their own affairs. This argument suggests that if local boards cannot do the job, province should step in. On the other side, there is a democratic argument against centralization. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives puts it this way: this neoliberal strategy of defunding, devaluing, and deposing is happening with public healthcare in Ontario. And now with education, it will be much easier for the Ford government to impose their back-to-basic agenda on educators and parents who know better without a messy democracy of elected school boards. These arguments emphasizes that local school matters. One parent quoted in Toronto Star said, "Someone who knows the area, who's from the area, who knows the school, who has the connection and relationship with the school administrators can help problem solve a little quicker, a little more logically, and a little smoother." When decisions are made far away, they do not always fit local needs, right? So this is true in both of the Philippines and Canada. Difference is that Canada had local voice, through elected schools boards and is now losing it, while Philippines never really had one tradition of local democratic control. So let us now turn to Newfoundland and Labrador, where I am now, which took a different path from Ontario. In 2022, Newfoundland and Labrador dissolved its English language school district, the NLSD, and currently it is called NL Schools. They eliminated the elected school board entirely. However, instead of simply centralizing all the power, they created something new, the Provincial Advisory Council on Education, or PASE. What is PASE? It is a members-based advisory council. It mandates to inform the government on K-12 education issues. It also provides a method for engagement between parents, community, school council, and government. The government explained it this way. The creation of an advisory council will give parents a stronger voice in the delivery of education. This raises important question. Does an appointed advisory council provide a stronger voice than the elected board? Or is it weaker? The answer depends on how the council is structured. Newfoundland and Labrador incorporated specific safeguards in their design, which we will examine. Let me explain how PASE is structured. A structure significantly affects how well a council can represent community voices. PASE has 9 to 15 members drawn from 3 groups. First, regional representatives. The province is divided into regions, between 4 and 7 of them. Each region sends 1 representative. These representatives are recommended by the school council and chairs in that region and then appointed by the minister. Second, 1 French first language representative. This person is recommended by the French first language school council and chairs. Third, up to 7 at-large members. These are appointed through the Independent Appointments Commission, a process designed to ensure qualified individuals are selected. A key safeguard is built into this structure. The at-large members must be fewer in number than a total number of regional representatives plus the French representative. This ensures that community voices, the regional reps, always constitute the majority. They cannot be outvoted by at-large appointees. Members serve up to 3 years with a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. Certain individuals cannot serve: students, department employees, school board employees, and government employees with responsibilities in facilities, transportation, or procurement. This helps avoid conflicts of interest. This design represents an attempt to balance expertise with community representation. Whether it works in practice remains to be seen, but the design itself demonstrates thoughtful consideration of democratic voice. So what are PASE's specific duties and powers? First, they advise the minister. Their role is to provide advice on how to enhance the quality of school programs, improve the learning environment, and increase student achievement. This is advisory power only. They do not make decisions, they advise those who do. Second, they communicate with school councils. They are required to maintain two-way communication with school councils across the province. This is how they stay connected to what is happening in communities. Third, they provide input channel. Schools council can provide input to PASE. So if a school council has a concern, they have a formal mechanism to raise it to the provincial level. Fourth, they may engage with organizations that provide educational support. This could include universities, nonprofits, or other relevant groups. PASE must meet at least 3 times per year. And importantly, their minutes must be made available to the public on request. This transparency measures allows people to see what was discussed and what advice was given. Comparing this to an elected school board reveals significant differences. An elected school board has real decision-making power over budgets, programs, and local issues. PASE can only advise. The real power remains in the provincial government. This raises the question, is an appointed advisory council an adequate substitute for elected local governance? Or does it provide sufficient voice for parents and communities? These questions remain open for evaluation. Newfoundland and Labrador has also undertaken another significant initiative, a 10-year transformation plan called Education Accord NL. This was established in January 2024 by Minister Crystal Howell. Its mandate is to transform and modernize the province's entire education system, from early childhood through K-12, post-secondary, and lifelong learning. Why was this needed? The province identified several significant challenges. First, mental health and well-being challenges among students. Second, learning loss resulting from COVID-19 pandemic. Third, chronic absenteeism affecting student outcomes. That's real. Fourth, lower adult literacy levels that impact the workforce and economy. Fifth, shifts in population that require schools to adapt to changing demographics. Six, bullying and school violence affecting students' safety and well-being. Seventh, the need for greater inclusion to ensure all students feel welcome and supported. What is striking about this list is how universal these challenges are. These same issues appear in the Philippines and in education system worldwide. Mental health, learning loss, absenteeism, literacy, demographic shifts, safety, and inclusion. These are common challenges facing education globally. The differences lies in how each system responds. Newfoundland and Labrador is attempting a comprehensive, long-term approach that brings together many different voices to create a 10-year plan. This kind of long-term thinking is valuable in education, which often suffers from reactive, short-term policy making. The Education Accord engaged extensively with the public, receiving 18,681 responses to their online survey. From this engagement, several key themes emerge. First, seamless transitions. Students need support as they move from early childhood into K-12, from K-12 into post-secondary, and post-secondary into lifelong learning or universities. These transition points are critical juncture where students can easily fall into the cracks. Second, wrap-around services. Schools cannot address all students' needs alone. Students require access to mental health support, nutrition, social services, and assistance for their families. Then these services are coordinated. Students can focus on learning. Third, community partnership. Schools should be connected with families, community organization, indigenous communities, and health services. Strong connections with a broader community contribute to stronger student outcomes. Fourth, empower the workforce. Educators, support staff, the faculty need better support through training, resources, and recognition. When teachers and staff are supported, students benefit. Fifth, holistic development. Academic success is important, but it is not only the goal. Students also need social and emotional well-being. They need to develop a sense of identity and belonging. They need to feel that they matter. These themes reflects on comprehensive understanding of education's role in child development. The idea of bringing together the education, health, and social services into coordinated system is a significant policy ambition. Newfoundland and Labrador also faces significant challenges in higher education, particularly the Memorial University, where I'm from, the province-only university. So, the funding context reveals the pattern of decline. In 2021, the government announced the 68.4 million in cuts to Memorial University over 5 years. In that same year, Memorial ended a 22-year tuition freeze that had kept costs stable for more than 2 decades. So in 2024, Memorial received a 298 million operating grant. While this sounds substantial, it actually represented an 8 million reduction from previous year. In 2025, the university faced 6.7 million operating deficit. In response, they announced 20 million in spending cuts and layoffs. The impact on students has been significant. Before 2021, in province tuition was 2,500. After the changes, it rose to 6,000 per course. Cost increased from $255 to $600 for a province with a population just over 500,000. Memorial University is critically important. It is the only university in the province, major employer, and the institution that trains teachers, nurses, engineers, and other professionals. When Memorial struggles, the entire province feels the effects. Students have organized in response. The Canadian Federation of Students of Newfoundland and Labrador has a campaign called Bring Back the Freeze, demanding tuition rollbacks and restored funding. So kaya mataas po yung tuition ngayon. In October 2025, Newfoundland and Labrador held provincial election, which education emerged as a major issue, particularly post-secondary. The Progressive Conservatives won the election with Tony Wakeham before Premier. Let me summarize each party platform regarding education. The Progressive Conservatives promise a temporary freeze on tuition and new construction at Memorial pending a review. Pending review. They also propose to refund tuition for graduates who stay and work in the province, creating an incentive for young people to remain in Newfoundland and Labrador rather than relocate. Additionally, they sought to align post-secondary education with labor market's needs. The Liberals, who were the incumbent party, proposed a $500 moving allowance for students moving from rural areas to St. John's. However, they did not mention reversing the funding cuts that had caused tuition rise. The NDP promised to roll back tuition to 1999 levels, which would represent a substantial reduction. They also pledged to fund Memorial University at whatever cost necessary. The Auditor General had previously funded in 2023. The Memorial had $481 million in deferred maintenance liabilities, buildings in need of repairs. There were also concerns about poor financial monitoring and salaries higher than equivalent public service position. So, kami nga ng mga kaibigan kong graduate students, they would rather teach in the basic education than going in the higher education. Kasi, mababa po yung sahod. These election platforms illustrate the ongoing tensions between fiscal constraint and investment in education, a tension that exists in both the Philippines and Canada. Now that we have examined both countries in detail, let us compare them systematically, starting with key differences. First, constitutional structure. The Philippines has a centralized national system. DepEd in Manila sets policy for entire country. Canada has a decentralized system with provincial jurisdiction and no federal Department of Education. Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador each operate on their own systems independently. Second, key government actors. In the Philippines, many actors are national agencies. DepEd, CHED, TESDA. In Canada, the main actors are provincial ministries. The Ontario Ministry of Education and the NL Department of Education. Third, local governance. The Philippines has school-based management, but research indicates it functions largely as a compliance exercise rather than the genuine empowerment. Schools fill out forms but do not have real decision-making power. Canada has elected school boards, but these are declining. In Ontario, they are losing power and facing provincial takeovers. In Newfoundland and Labrador, they have been replaced with an appointed advisory council. Fourth, recent trends. The Philippines is moving forward strengthened coordination through the EDCOM model, attempting to make national agencies work better together. In Canada, Ontario is moving towards centralization and provincial takeovers, while Newfoundland and Labrador is experimenting with a new advisory model. Fifth, democratic models. The Philippines has a history of sectoral representation dating back to 1954, where various groups had seats on education boards. Canada had elected school boards, but those are eroding. Both countries faces challenges in maintaining meaningful community voice in education decisions. Despite these differences, there are striking similarities in the challenges both countries face. First, both faces centralization pressure. The Philippines struggles with DepEd centralization despite policies intended to empower local schools. Canada struggles with provinces centralizing power from school boards. In both countries, power is moving upward away from local communities. Second, both face democratic governance challenges. The Philippines has school-based management that functions as compliance rather than empowerment. Local schools lack genuine voice. Canada has declining voter turnout into school board elections and boards that many view as irrelevant. In Newfoundland and Labrador, elected boards have been replaced with appointed councils. In both countries, mechanisms for citizens' voice are weak. Third, both face fiscal challenges. The Philippines contends with underfunding, leading to classroom shortages and the turn to PPPs. Canada also faces underfunding, as evidenced by Memorial University's cuts and underfunding on Ontario schools. Financial constraints are universal. Fourth, both are influenced by international organizations like OECD. PISA results shape policy debates in both countries. Philippines uses PISA to justify curriculum reforms. Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador monitor PISA results closely. Fifth, both have active non-state actors. The Philippines has PIBED, foundations, and PPPs. Canada has teachers' unions, students' federations, and advocacy coalitions. In both countries, these organizations shapes policy in visible and less visible ways. The fundamental question both countries face is the same. Who should control education, and how do we ensure that control serves the public good? The specific answers may differ, but underlying question is universal. Based on our comparative analysis, we can identify several mechanisms through which organizations shape education policy. First, through formal channels. This includes contracts such as the PPP's building schools in the Philippines. They include legislations such as Bill 333 in Ontario, giving the government more power over school boards. They include regulations such as the PASEL legislations in NL. When organizations can shape these formal instruments, they exercise direct influence. Second, through informal channels, they include personal networks among officials, advocates, and researchers. They include trust and reputation, which determine who gets listened to. They include coalitions, such as the student and faculty advocacy at Memorial University. When people know and trust each other, information flows and influence occurs. Third, through bureaucratic effectiveness, this is a more subtle mechanism. Organizations can place staff in government positions, improving how the bureaucracy functions. This creates researchers call strategic patchwork. Intentional placement of staff to improve coordination and reduce friction. When former EDCOM researchers move into DepEd, they bring expertise and connections with them. Fourth, through international benchmarking, organizations like the OECD create comparative data that pressures national governments. When PISA results show the Philippines near the bottom, it creates political pressure to reform. When Canadian provinces see their rankings, questions arise about performance. 5. Through what might be termed democratic erosion, when local bodies lose power, as school boards have in Canada, other organizations fill the vacuum. Provincial ministries gain more control, advocacy groups shift the focus, parents lose channels for influence. This is often unintended consequences of other decisions, but it is fundamentally reshapes who has influence. Now let me highlight emerging research that sheds light on an often overlooked source of organizational influence, the mid-level staff in government bureaucracies. Recent research by Jose Ayos Trinidad suggests that educational change can occur through what he calls mid-level networks. Who are mid-level staff? They include technical assistants, program coordinators, data analysts, office managers, and module developers. These are not high-profile political appointees or agencies. They are the career-level servants who perform the day-to-day work of policy implementation. What makes them important? They sit between policymakers at the top of implementers on the ground. They understand both worlds. They know what policymakers intend and what is actually possible in school and communities. Trinidad research demonstrates that these mid-level staff can be strategically placed to improve bureaucratic effectiveness. They can coordinate policies across different offices. They can reduce friction by smoothing communication. They can share information informally across organizational boundaries. In the Philippine context, this includes staff in DepEd Central, technical panels, CHED, and regional office personnel. In the Canadian context, this includes provincial ministry officials, school district superintendents, and board staff. The key insight is that organizational influence is not solely about high-level decisions. It also encompasses the thousands of everyday decisions made by the people throughout the system. Understanding these mid-level networks is essentially for comprehending how policy actually gets made and implemented. Building on this research, Trinidad introduces the concept of strategic patchwork. Strategic patchwork refers to the intentional placement of staff in government positions to improve bureaucratic effectiveness. The metaphor suggests sewing different pieces of fabric together to create something stronger and more coherent. The concept has three key elements. First, intentional placement. Organizations strategically positions their people in government roles. This might involve encouraging staff to take positions in government agencies or recruiting people with government experience. These movements create connections between organizations. Second, reputational distinctiveness. These individuals are known for quality work. They possess credibility because they deliver results. When they speak, people listen because they have demonstrated competence. A mid-level staff person known for effectiveness can have influence beyond their formal position. Third, the purposeful connection. These individuals maintain networks with others. Even when working in different offices or agencies, they stay in touch. They share information, they coordinate informally. When problems arise, they know whom to contact. How does this work in practice? When organizations place staff strategically, several outcomes emerge. Policies become more coordinated across agencies. Friction is reduced because people know each other and can work through problems informally. Information flows more freely through personal networks. In the Philippine context, examples include the EDCOM2 researchers moving into policy roles in DepEd or CHED, bringing their expertise and connections. In the Canadian context, example included former trustees becoming ministry officials, bringing local knowledge to provincial policy. The strategic patchwork concept reveals that the organizational influence is not solely about the formal structure, but also involves people who move through system, carrying knowledge, relationship, and credibility with them. Now let us apply strategic foresight, looking ahead to what the future might hold for organizational influence in education policy. For the Philippines, several emerging trends deserve attention. First, strengthened interagency coordination. The proposed EDCOM3 model, with agency heads having voting power, could create more coherent policy across DepEd, CHED, and TESDA. This might reduce the fragmentation that has historically characterized Philippine education reform. The key question is whether this will actually reduce fragmentation or simply create additional bureaucracy. Second, the expanded PPPs, public-private partnerships in education, and the PISIP demonstrate the PPPs can accelerate infrastructure development. Second, expanded PPPs in education or public-private partnerships in education. PISP3 demonstrate the PPPs can accelerate infrastructure development. The question is whether this model expand into other areas such as curriculum development, teacher training, or educational technology. This raises concerns about private influence on core educational functions. Third, decentralization pressure. EDCOM2 research emphasizes the need for shared governance that gives local actors more authority. This challenges is whether the system can move beyond the culture of control over compliance that currently characterizes DepEd. Fourth, the OECD influence. As the Philippines continues to participate in PISA and engage with OECD networks, international benchmarking will continue to shape policy debates. The question is how to balance global standards with local contexts. Attention that former Secretary Biones highlighted. For Ontario, the emerging trends are different but equally significant. First, school board survival. 7 boards are under supervision, and Bill 33 gives government expanded powers. The question is whether elected school boards will survive in any meaningful form. Will they continue to exist but with diminished power, or will they be abolished entirely as occurred in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador? Second, continued centralization. The province is making more decisions that were previously made locally. This centralization has consequences for local voice, democratic accountability, and public trust. The question is, what will replace local voice if boards continue to lose power? Third, the need for democratic innovation. If school boards continue to decline, new mechanisms are needed for parents and communities to be heard. The Newfoundland and Labrador PASE represents one attempt, but the question remains whether an appointment advisory council is sufficient. Fourth, funding pressures. Many problems in school boards in fighting mismanagement dysfunctions are rooted in underfunding. When resources are insufficient, tensions rise. The question is whether the province will address the root cause or continue with takeovers. As one of the parents noted, local knowledge enables problems to be solved more quickly and smoothly. When decisions are made remotely, that local knowledge is lost. The challenge for Ontario is preserving local voice while addressing legitimate problems that some boards have faced. For Newfoundland and Labrador, the future holds promise and uncertainty. First, the new governance model. PASE replaces the elected school district with an appointed advisory council. The question is whether this appointed council will provide sufficient voice for parents and communities. Will people feel heard, or will they feel even more distant from decisions? Second, the 10-year transformation plan, Education Accord NL, is ambitious, aiming to transform the entire education system over a decade. The question is whether the plan will survive political changes. A new government was elected in October 2025. Will they continue the accord or initiate their own approaches? Third, the Memorial University crisis, funding cuts, tuition hikes, and deferred maintenance threaten the province-only university. The question is how to sustain the memorial, which is essential for training teachers, nurses, and other professionals. If memorial declines, the entire province suffers. Fourth, the democratic experiment. Newfoundland and Labrador is attempting something new, replacing elected boards with an appointed council. The question is whether this becomes a model for other provinces or cautionary tale. The experience of Nova Scotia, which abolished school boards in 2018, offers a warning. After abolition, community input weakened. The Premier promised to reinstate boards but did not. Policy delays were cited as consequences of lost local voice. Newfoundland and Labrador must ensure that their new structure genuinely works for communities, not merely for the government. When we examine all three contexts together, several common themes emerge. First, centralization. The Philippines struggles with DepEd's central control despite policies intended to empower local schools. Ontario is centralizing power through provincial takeovers. Newfoundland and Labrador replaces elected boards with an appointed council. All three, power is moving upward. Second, local voice. The Philippines has school-based management that functions as compliance rather than empowerment. Ontario has school boards under supervision. Newfoundland and Labrador has appointed council. In all three, mechanisms for local voice are weak. Third, democratic challenges. The Philippines struggles with how to make empowerment real rather than merely procedural. Ontario struggles with whether trustees can be relevant and effective. Newfoundland and Labrador experiments with appointed versus elected governance. All three are seeking to balance expertise within democracy. Fourth, fiscal pressure. The Philippines turns to PPPs or public-private partnerships to build classrooms because government cannot build them fast enough. Ontario faces underfunding that contributes to boards' dysfunction. Newfoundland and Labrador has a funding crisis at Memorial University. All three face resource constraints. Fifth, international influence. The OECD, through PISA and other activities, shapes policy debates in all three contexts. The Philippines uses PISA to justify curriculum reforms. Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador monitor PISA closely. The question is how each context mediates that influence through its own institutions and values. The fundamental question uniting all three is who should control education and how do we ensure the control serves the public good. Now let me conclude by drawing out implications for different audiences. For policymakers, this analysis suggests several considerations. First, recognize that organizations shape what is possible. Policy emerges from complex interactions among government agencies, non-state actors, and international organizations. Second, build relationship across organizational boundaries. Formal structures matter, but informal networks often determine whether policies actually work. Third, learn from comparative cases. The Philippines, Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Canada have different systems, but each can learn from each other's experiences. For educators, here are key implications. First, understand the organizational context of your work. Policies that shape your classroom originate from somewhere. Knowing the organizations behind of them helps you understand why policies take of their particular form. Second, build networks with colleagues and mid-level staff. These individuals can help you navigate the system and advocate for change. Third, Participate in policy discussions when possible. Your voice matters because you understand what works in the classroom. For researchers, consider these directions. First, study the inter-organizational networks, not just single organization. Relationships between organizations are often as important as the organizations themselves. Second, examine both formal and informal connections. Do not limit your focus to contracts and official partnerships. Examine who talks to whom, who trusts to whom, who shares information with whom. Third, conduct comparative studies. Comparing across contexts reveals patterns that might not be visible in a single country studies. For citizens and parents, here is what you should know. First, pay attention to who is influencing your school. It is not just school boards or the Department of Education. It also includes foundations, business, and international organization. Second, vote in school board elections where they exist. Even if boards appear weak, they remain a channel for democratic voice. Third, demand transparency. You have a right to know how decisions are made and who is making them. Fourth, organize with others. Individual voices are easily ignored, but collective voices are harder to dismiss. Now, let me summarize the key takeaways from today's presentation. First, organizations matter. They shape education policy from outside and inside government in the Philippines, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. Understanding who these organizations are and how they operate is essential for understanding how education policy is actually made. Second, context matters. Constitutional structures, historical patterns, and current crisis shape how influence operates. The Philippines' centralized system creates different dynamics than Canada's provincial system. The 1954 sectoral model in the Philippines creates different possibilities than the 1867 constitutional division in Canada. Third, networks are key. The structure of relationship between organizations affects how policies are implemented. Tight coupling produces swift, uniform change. Loose coupling produces slower, more varied change. Inter-organizational networks, both formal and informal, shapes what is possible. Fourth, international organizations like OECD are increasingly influential. Through PISA and other activities, the OECD shapes how countries think about education quality and reform. All three contexts are affected in different ways. Fifth, democratic governance is under pressure everywhere. The Philippines struggle to make school-based management system meaningful. Ontario struggles with school board takeovers and declining relevance. Newfoundland and Labrador experiments with appointed councils. Finding ways to give citizens genuine voice in education is an urgent challenge. Six, the mid-level staff are overlooked but important influencers. The people who work in bureaucracies, technical assistants, program coordinators, data analysts shape policy through their daily work. Understanding these mid-level networks is essential for understanding how policy actually gets made. Seven, comparative analysis reveals patterns. By comparing the Philippines, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador, we see that all face challenges: centralization, democratic accountability, fiscal pressure, international influence, but with different responses shaped by their unique contexts. 8. Strategic foresights offer tools for anticipating and shaping organizational influence. By examining emerging trends, we can ask better questions about future and work to ensure that organizational influence serves the public good. I would like to conclude by posing several questions for discussion or for reflections. Question I hope you will consider as you reflect on this material. First, think about your own educational context. What organizations influence policy in your setting? Are their roles visible or hidden? Who is at the table? Who is missing? Second, compare the three cases we have discussed. What can Philippine, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador learn from each other? Are there policies or practices from one context that might be adapted to another? Or the transferable knowledge that you can get? And third, what should happen with school boards? Should they be preserved, abolished, or reinvented? What would meaningful local voice would like in education governance? Fourth, how can we ensure the organizational influence serves the public good, especially marginalized communities, rather than the public interests, or the private interests, rather? Organizations have their own interests and agendas, and how do we ensure that public interest prevails? Fifth, What role should international organizations like the OECD play in national and provincial education policy? They provide valuable data and comparative insights. However, there are also risks of uncritically adapting global standards. How should countries balance global benchmarking with local context and values? Thank you very much for listening.